Who the hell are you supposed to be? Some nobody in a cheap suit playing hero for a waitress? Preston Whitaker said it loud enough for the entire dining room to hear, and 43 people heard it. Seconds earlier, he'd grabbed Bianca Marsh by the wrist and torn her uniform open in front of all of them. She was 27. Working a double shift she couldn't afford to lose, and she'd stood there with both hands, holding her ruined shirt closed while a man she'd never met told the whole room exactly what he thought she was worth. Nobody stood up. 2 guests turned their heads away. One lifted a phone and started recording. The floor manager was 10 feet away, and she didn't move. Preston wasn't afraid of anybody. His father was a United States Senator from Illinois, and in 29 years, every single thing Preston had ever broken got cleaned up by a lawyer before sunrise. He'd never once been told no. So when a man rose from the corner table, dark suit, no jewelry, no name anybody in that room would have recognized, Preston saw exactly what he wanted to see. He pointed a finger in the man's face and told him he'd be finished by morning. He was wrong about almost everything. That man hadn't come to that restaurant alone, and he wasn't somebody you threatened in a room full of witnesses. He'd just picked a fight with the one man in Chicago who could have made him disappear before the sun came up, and he had no idea. If a story like this hits something in you, go ahead and hit that like button. Share it with somebody who needs to hear it. And if you're new here, subscribe. We tell stories about people who are never quite what they appear to be. Now let's get back to that dining room. Calvin Ferrante didn't take a single step back. He simply draped his suit jacket over Bianca's shoulders, pulled it closed in front of her, then turned so that his body stood between her and Preston, and he said exactly one sentence, his voice as ordinary as if he were reminding someone what time the place closed. You just tore the clothes of a woman who's here doing her job. Go home, before tonight becomes something you can't fix. Preston waited for more. He had already prepared 3 lines to throw back at whatever this man said next, and all 3 became useless because nothing followed. Calvin didn't say another word. He didn't look away either. Preston stood there 1 beat longer than was comfortable, then let out a dry laugh, the kind of laugh a man makes when he wants the whole room to know that none of this is worth his concern. He flicked one hand as though brushing away a speck of dust. He muttered something about the place going downhill, went back to his table, snatched up his coat, and told his 2 friends to get up. Julian Pike rose slowly, his eyes still fixed on Calvin, his lips pressed tight in the way of a man who had just been denied something he'd been waiting to watch. Blake Turner got to his feet much faster, and he was the only one of the 3 who walked out without looking at Bianca even once. The restaurant door closed behind them, and the entire dining room seemed to breathe out at the same time. 43 people who had remained silent for nearly 2 full minutes suddenly remembered that they were in the middle of dinner. The sound of knives and forks returned first, then conversation, hesitant at the beginning, then gradually normal again, and within about 30 seconds the room was moving exactly as it had before any of this happened, except now no one looked toward Bianca. Before, everyone had been looking at her, now no one did. And she couldn't decide which of those 2 things felt worse. Dana Kowalski came over. The floor manager had been standing about 10 feet away from the beginning without moving, and now she approached with both hands clasped in front of her stomach, started with, Bianca, then stopped, then tried again by asking whether she wanted to sit in the break room for a little while. Bianca shook her head. She didn't say anything. She only shook her head once, and Dana understood, and Dana stepped back. And that was the entire conversation between 2 women who had worked beside each other for 14 months. Calvin didn't involve himself in it. He had stepped aside when Dana came near, far enough away not to hear, close enough to still be there. When Bianca turned, he only tilted his head toward the hallway leading behind the kitchen, and she followed, not because he told her to, but because at that moment she needed some direction in which to walk, and he was the only person who had given her one. He didn't touch her again. All the way through the kitchen, past cooks who deliberately lowered their eyes toward their pots, he kept exactly an arm's length between them and didn't shorten that distance once. When they reached the alley behind the restaurant, he stopped and asked her 2 questions. The first was whether she was hurt anywhere. The second was whether there was anyone who could take her home. Bianca answered the first by shaking her head, and the second with a single word, no. And the moment she said it, she realized it was the first sound she had managed to make all evening. Calvin nodded. He took out his phone, made a brief call that lasted no more than 15 seconds, then slipped it back into his pocket. 2 minutes later, a car pulled up at the mouth of the alley. He walked over, spoke a few words to the driver, handed cash through the window in advance, and she heard him repeat an address somewhere in Bridgeport that she had never given him. But by then her mind was drifting, and she couldn't hold on to the detail long enough to understand it. He opened the car door for her. He didn't ask her name. He didn't give her a business card. He didn't say anything like, "If you need something, call me." And he didn't say that the other man would pay for what he'd done. And he didn't ask whether she wanted to call the police. He simply stood there until she was seated, closed the door, and stepped back from the curb. The car pulled away. Bianca looked back through the rear window, and she saw him still standing at the mouth of the alley. And she saw 4 men come out through the restaurant door at that exact moment. 4 men who had been sitting with him at the corner table all evening, and one of them was the old man who had carried the paper ledger. They didn't say anything to Calvin. They simply came outside and stood waiting. And not one of those 4 men looked back toward the restaurant even once. Every one of them was watching the street. Then the turn swallowed them from view, and she couldn't see anything anymore. She sat without moving for the entire 20-minute ride. The suit jacket was still around her shoulders. Only when the car stopped in front of her building did she realize she had never taken it off, and she had meant to fold it neatly so she could return it, but the driver pulled away before she could ask who it was supposed to go back to. Inside her apartment, she removed it and turned the lining outward, searching for a label, a tailor's name, anything at all. There was nothing, not a single word, only smooth lining and perfectly even rows of hand stitching. And Bianca Marsh, 27 years old, who had just lost her Saturday night dinner and some piece of herself she still couldn't name, sat down on the edge of her bed and held the jacket in her lap for a long while, with no idea that she was holding the one thing in the entire city that no one dared ask the price of. Bianca washed the suit jacket by hand in the sink at nearly 1 a.m. because she didn't dare put it in the washing machine. The wine stain on the front came out completely after the 3rd rinse. She wrung it out as gently as she could, hung it on a hanger behind the bathroom door, and stood looking at it for a while before turning off the light. Her uniform was in a trash bag beside the sink, beyond saving, and the restaurant charged $45 for every replacement set. She wrote that number in the graph paper notebook she kept in a drawer, beneath the electric bill and above the monthly bus pass. The next morning, she caught the 7:15 bus to Oak Park. She wore the soft-soled shoes she had worn down almost to the final layer, the pair she had lined with wide strips of tape inside the heels back in March to keep them from rubbing her skin raw, and 3 times she had calculated whether she could afford to replace them, and 3 times she had decided she couldn't. Ashwood Memory Care sat at the end of a quiet road, and Margaret Marsh was in room number 7. She was 62 years old. She had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at 56, a little more than a year after she had started forgetting the names of the streets around her own home. And by this stage, she spent most of her time living in some year in which Bianca had never existed. That morning, Margaret turned toward her and called her Colleen. Colleen was her younger sister, who had died in 1994. She asked Colleen whether she had brought her driver's license because Mom would be furious if the 2 of them took the car again without saying anything. Bianca sat on the edge of the bed, took her mother's hand, and said yes, she had brought it. Margaret smiled, reassured, and went on telling some story about that summer. Bianca listened for 40 minutes, nodding in the right places, and didn't correct her even once. On the way out, the administrative coordinator called her back to the desk. Medicaid covered the basic level of care, but Ashwood was a private memory care facility, and the monthly difference was $1,840. The deadline was Friday. They told her in a voice filled with genuine sympathy, because this was the 2nd month in a row, and because they had watched too many families reach this exact point. Bianca said she would take care of it. On top of that amount, she still carried $74,000 in medical debt from the diagnosis period and 2 hospitalizations before her mother entered Ashwood, a debt she was paying at $190 a month and would still be paying long after she turned 50. She worked double shifts 4 days a week just to keep all those numbers from collapsing into one another. That afternoon, she arrived at the restaurant half an hour early because she needed to ask for a pay advance. Dana Kowalski met her at the employee entrance and told her to come into the office. A sheet of paper was already waiting on the desk. Dana didn't circle around the point, and Bianca didn't need her to. The restaurant was terminating her employment, effective immediately. There was no notice period. There was no severance. Illinois was an at-will employment state, and they didn't need a reason at all, but they had written one into the report anyway, and the reason listed there was causing a disturbance in the service area. Bianca read that exact line twice. She asked Dana whether she was saying that Bianca was the one who had caused what happened the night before. Dana didn't answer that question. She looked down at the desk and said the decision wasn't hers, that it had come from higher up before 9 that morning, and that when she had called to ask about it, she had been told not to ask again. Then she added one more sentence she probably shouldn't have said. Whitaker Holdings owned 31% of the restaurant chain. After saying it, she fell silent. And she still didn't look up. Bianca sat there quietly for a moment. Then she signed the paper because refusing to sign wouldn't change anything. And because she needed her final 2 weeks of pay deposited on time. She asked when the money would reach her account. Dana said Friday. Bianca nodded because Friday was also Ashwood's deadline. And in her head she calculated that 2 weeks of wages would come to $960 after taxes, leaving her $880 short. She stood up. At the door, Dana called her name. She said she was sorry. She said she should have stepped forward the night before. Bianca stopped with one hand on the doorknob, and she didn't turn around. And she said, yes, you should have. Then she walked out. She gathered her things from the employee locker, walked 3 blocks to the bus stop because that day she couldn't bear to sit and wait in front of the restaurant, and stood there for nearly 20 minutes. She had $123 in cash in her pocket. There were $41 in her bank account. Her mother's payment was due in 4 days. And at home, hanging behind the bathroom door, was a suit jacket with no label that she had no idea how to return, belonging to a man whose name she didn't know, the only person among 43 people the night before who had stood up, and the man she was almost certain she would never see again. The video appeared on Monday morning. It was 19 seconds long. It began at the exact moment the wine bottle tipped, showing Bianca jerking her hand back, showing Preston Whitaker springing to his feet, and it ended there, before anything that happened afterward. The person who filmed it was Blake Turner, who had been sitting at the same table, recording the entire thing on his own phone, because the group had a habit of filming Preston's little performances so they could watch them later for amusement. But what was released wasn't Blake's original recording. It was a cleanly edited 19-second clip that someone had cut down with care. Within 2 days, it was everywhere on local news sites, under captions saying that a waitress had spilled wine on a customer and caused a disturbance at a Gold Coast restaurant. The comments called her a troublemaker, called her the kind of person who picked fights with wealthy customers. And one person wrote that she deserved to be fired, not knowing she had already been fired Saturday afternoon. Bianca didn't read all of it. She read enough to understand what was happening, then shut off her phone and started applying for jobs. She applied to 7 places in 4 days. 3 restaurants in the South Loop, 2 diners near her apartment, 1 coffee shop, and 1 cashier position at a grocery store. She listed 14 months of serving experience at an upscale restaurant and included the restaurant's name because she had nothing else to put down. No one called back. No one rejected her. They simply stayed silent. And that silence felt exactly like the silence of the 43 people in the dining room on Saturday night. And she realized she was beginning to get used to it. On Thursday morning, the landlord taped a notice to her apartment door. It was a 30-day termination notice, with no renewal. She called downstairs to ask about it. They told her there had been a complaint. She asked what the complaint was about, who had made it, and when it had been made. They said there had been a complaint, said nothing more, and hung up. Bianca stood in the kitchen holding the phone for a while longer before setting it down on the table. She had lived there for 2.5 years and had never once paid her rent late. There were 3 days left before Ashwood's deadline. She counted the money in her pocket and in her account again, added the $960 from her final 2 weeks of wages that would arrive on Friday, and the result was still $880 short, exactly as it had been the day before, because in 4 days, nothing had changed except that now she was about to lose her home. Thursday afternoon, she went to Oak Park to visit her mother as usual. That day, Margaret didn't call her by any name at all. She only held Bianca's hand and looked out the window, and Bianca sat listening to her mother's breathing for more than an hour without saying a word. By the time she reached the bus stop outside Ashwood's gates, evening was beginning to settle in, and there was a man standing there with his hands in the pockets of his coat, carrying nothing. Bianca recognized him before he had a chance to say a single word. Calvin Ferrante nodded to her, then asked how much time she had. She said the bus would be there in 11 minutes. He said that was enough. He didn't ask how she had been. He didn't mention the video, didn't mention that she had lost her job, didn't mention Saturday night. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out a piece of paper, folded in half, and handed it to her. Written on it was an address in River North, the name of a manager, and an hourly wage. He told her the place needed someone, that they would take her starting Monday if she wanted the job, and that her shifts would be arranged so she could still visit her mother in the afternoons. Bianca looked at the number written on the paper. It was twice what she had made at the old restaurant, even with tips. She folded the paper again, held it in her palm, and asked him one question, directly, without lowering her voice. What do you want in return? Calvin didn't look offended. He said nothing. She asked again, saying that he was offering her a job that paid twice as much, that she wouldn't owe him anything at all, and that he expected her to believe that. He said she didn't have to believe it. He said if she didn't, she could work there for 1 week and quit, and he wouldn't come looking for her again. The bus appeared at the far end of the road. Bianca stood there with the folded paper in her hand, thinking about Friday, thinking about the $880 she was still short, thinking about the 30 days she had left in her apartment, and she knew she was going to accept. And she also knew that if she accepted this way, there was one more thing she needed to say now, not later. She said she would take the job. Then she added that she had one condition. Calvin waited. Bianca looked straight at him and said, "Don't ever pay for anything for me without asking me first." She said she didn't care how much it was, didn't care why, didn't care how good he thought it would be for her. "Not 1 cent, unless you've asked me first." She said that was the only thing she still had left, and she wouldn't trade it for a job, not even this one. Calvin listened until she was finished. He didn't ask why. He didn't offer any exceptions. Didn't say unless it's an emergency. Didn't say we'll see. He only nodded once, slowly and clearly, the kind of nod a man gives when he has just accepted a term, not when he has just listened to a complaint. Then the bus pulled up to the curb. Bianca climbed aboard, found a seat, and when she turned to look back, he was already gone. The manager in River North hired her exactly as the note had said, without asking why she had left her old job, without asking about the video, simply handing her 2 uniforms and telling her to start with the Monday afternoon shift. On her first day, Bianca worked 7 hours and went home with $112 in tips. On the second day, it was $134. By Friday evening, together with the $960 from her final 2 weeks at the old restaurant that had already reached her account, she transferred the full $1,840 to Ashwood before closing time. The confirmation email arrived at 4:42 in the afternoon, and she read it 3 times in the employee break room before going back out to the floor. But by the end of that first week, she had begun noticing other things. At the old restaurant, everyone called the owner by name. Here, no one called Calvin Ferrante by his first name. Not once. Not even the manager. Not even the woman behind the wine counter who had worked there for 9 years. They called him Sir. They said, "Sir is here. Sir is in the back room. Sir wants to see this week's inventory book." When he walked through the kitchen, everyone kept working. No one stopped. No one greeted him loudly. But the rhythm changed. The way knives touched cutting boards became just a little softer, and the change was so small that if you hadn't stood there for an entire week, you would have missed it. The head chef was the only person who spoke directly to him for more than 2 sentences at a time. He called him boss. Bianca had worked under plenty of owners, and she knew what an employee sounded like when he called someone boss. There was professional respect in it, and underneath that, usually a little buried resentment. This chef's voice was different. It was the voice of a man who owed something. It was the careful voice of someone slowly repaying a debt that money couldn't settle. And every time he said the word boss, there was the briefest pause before it, as though he had to swallow some other word before he could let that one out. Then there was the matter of the door. On Wednesday afternoon, Calvin left the restaurant at nearly 7, and Bianca was carrying a tray through the front corridor when she saw a man she had never met step outside ahead of him, stop on the front step, look down the street to the left, then to the right, then across at the row of parked cars. The man didn't say anything. He simply stood there for about 4 seconds, then stepped down to the curb, and only then did Calvin come outside. Bianca stopped in the middle of the hallway with the tray still in her hands. She had seen people hold doors open for owners before. She had never seen anyone read a street for one. And what stayed with her wasn't the act itself, but the fact that no one inside the restaurant reacted at all, as if it happened every day. And maybe it did. That Tuesday morning, the old man with the paper ledger came back. Bianca recognized him immediately, because he had been one of the 4 men who walked out of the Gold Coast restaurant that Saturday night. The one carrying the book. His name was Vincent Cardoza, 62 years old. And she knew that because the manager mentioned it while telling her not to clear table 3 before 10 o'clock. He arrived at exactly 8 in the morning, sat in the same place, drank black coffee without sugar, and opened the hardbound ledger in front of him. He didn't carry a phone. Bianca never once saw him take one out during the nearly hour-long meeting, and she had never seen anyone his age sit through a meeting without a phone face down somewhere on the table. He wrote with a fountain pen. When Calvin sat across from him, the 2 men spoke very quietly, and every few minutes Vincent turned the ledger around to show him a page, then turned it back, then wrote some more. Before leaving, he tore the written pages out of the book, folded them, and slipped them into the inside pocket of his coat. He left behind no scrap of paper on the table. Bianca cleared that table every Tuesday morning for 3 weeks in a row, and not once did she find so much as a single written line. She didn't ask. That was a decision she made during the first week, and she kept it. She didn't ask the manager, didn't ask the woman at the wine counter, didn't ask the head chef. She didn't ask Calvin either, and Calvin didn't explain. He was at the restaurant about 3 times a week, usually in the afternoon, usually seated at the corner table near the kitchen door, and not once did he call her over to ask how she was doing or remind her who had found the job for her. Some days he nodded when he passed her, some days he didn't. In her locker, she kept the neatly folded suit jacket she had washed that first night, waiting for the right moment to return it. But between her strict boundaries and his distant presence, the moment never came. On the 11th day, while she was wiping down the last table at the end of her shift, he stopped for half a step and asked her one question: whether working this shift still gave her enough time to get to Oak Park. She said yes. He nodded and kept walking. That was the entire conversation. That night, on the bus back to Bridgeport, Bianca sat beside the window and thought about the almost invisible pause before the word boss, and about the man who had spent 4 seconds reading the street, and about a paper ledger that never left so much as 1 page behind. She knew she was seeing the shape of something very large, something she still couldn't name. She also knew that if she asked, she would probably get an answer, and that was exactly why she didn't ask. Preston Whitaker couldn't sleep, and what irritated him most was that he couldn't find any legitimate reason for it. He had won. The waitress had lost her job before 9 o'clock Monday morning. The 19-second video was moving exactly in the direction he wanted. Not a single newspaper had printed his name. Not one phone call had come from his father's office. Everything had been cleaned up neatly, just as it had been for the past 29 years. And by this point, the whole thing should have been over, and he should have forgotten about it within 48 hours. But he kept waking at 3 in the morning, and every time he woke, the first thing that came into his mind wasn't the girl, and it wasn't the torn shirt. It was the 11 words that man had said to him, spoken in that calm voice as though he were reminding someone of closing time, followed by silence and nothing more. Preston had waited. That was the part that was wrong. All his life, whenever he pushed someone that far, they always responded somehow. They either backed down, argued, or called a lawyer, and he knew how to deal with every one of those reactions. That man had done none of them, and no one had called afterward either. No lawsuit, no attorney's letter, no threat, no consequence of any kind, and it was precisely that absence of anything that kept Preston lying awake in the dark with his eyes open. By the middle of the week, he called a man who specialized in digging through records, someone his father's office regularly used for matters that were better kept off paper. Preston gave him everything he had, which was almost nothing: a face from the video Blake had recorded, an estimated height, the name of the restaurant, and the exact night in question. The man took 4 days. Then he called back and read Preston a list of everything he couldn't find. There were no tax records in the state of Illinois under this man's name, no social media, not a single account, not one tagged photograph in the past 10 years, no business license, no name listed on the board of any publicly registered company, no court records, no criminal history, not even a parking ticket. The man said he had found a few things, but every trail stopped at the second layer. One address led to a limited liability company. That company led to another company, and that one was registered in Delaware with no individual names attached to it at all. Then he added one more sentence, and his voice sounded completely different from the one he had used while reading the list. He said, "Mr. Whitaker, you paid me to look, so I looked. But I'm advising you to stop here." Preston asked why. The man didn't answer. He only said he would send the invoice, and wouldn't accept any more work connected to this matter, then hung up. Preston sat completely still for a long time after that call. An ordinary person left a trail. An important person left a great many trails. A person who left no trail at all was either nobody, or something Preston had never even possessed the language to name. And that second possibility, instead of frightening him, made him so furious he could barely breathe. Because if the man truly was something powerful, then being ignored for an entire week didn't mean Preston had been forgiven. It meant he wasn't important enough to be worth the trouble. On Friday, he called Julian Pike and Blake Turner over. He set his phone on the table and let them hear everything the investigator had said. Julian laughed when it was over. Julian said that made things even simpler. No records meant no one backing him. No one backing him meant they could do whatever they wanted. Julian said all they needed to know was where the man went and at what times, and by the following week they could finish it cleanly. with no one knowing a thing. Blake said nothing through that entire part. Only after Julian finished did Blake speak. And when he did, he was direct. He said what had happened at the restaurant had already gone too far. Blake said he had recorded the entire night on his own phone, that he had watched the full version 3 times, and that what he saw in the complete recording looked nothing like the 19 seconds circulating online. Blake said the girl hadn't done anything. Blake said that if they stopped now, it could still end here. Preston looked at him. Then he asked one question and one question only. So whose side are you on now? Blake didn't answer. Julian laughed and made a few remarks about Blake getting soft lately, and Preston brushed all of it aside with the same flick of his hand he had used in the restaurant, then said he didn't need anyone to agree with him. He only needed to know who that man was and where he went. He said he would find out himself if he had to. Blake stood up first and left without saying another word. Julian stayed another half hour, and the two of them talked at length about several very specific ways to handle it. That night, for the first time all week, Preston slept, because now he had something to do, and because there was only one question left in his mind, the simplest question of all, and also the one he had never once in his life been forced to ask about anyone. Who the hell are you to tell me no? By the 4th week, the kitchen sent out a dessert plate for the staff at the end of the shift, and the manager set Bianca's portion aside and told her the kitchen had made a different one, especially for her, because the other dessert contained almond flour. Bianca stood perfectly still for a second. She hadn't told anyone at this restaurant that she was allergic to almonds. She had mentioned it only once, during the interview, when they asked whether she had any dietary restrictions so they could arrange her staff meals, and she had answered casually and forgotten all about it. The manager said the boss had given instructions during her first week. Bianca carried her plate to the staff table and ate every bite, and she didn't say anything about it to anyone. But from that day on, she began paying attention to Calvin Ferrante in a different way. She realized he never sat with his back to a door. Not once. On any afternoon. At any table. If someone was already sitting at the corner table, he waited. If he had to sit in the middle of the room, he chose the chair facing the entrance. One day she watched him change seats with Vincent Cardoza without either man saying a word. Mr. Cardoza simply stood and shifted over, as naturally as if the two of them had done it 1,000 times before. She also noticed that Calvin never allowed anyone to remain behind him for more than a few seconds. Not even her. Not even when she was only pouring water. Near the end of that month, when her shift ran later than usual, and the last bus had already gone, he told her he would drive her home. Bianca started to refuse, then looked at the time, then didn't. They said almost nothing on the ride back to Bridgeport, but when the car turned into her neighborhood, he didn't stop in front of her building. He pulled over half a block away, beneath a streetlight near a convenience store that was still open, and told her he would wait there until she was safely inside. She asked why he didn't park directly in front of the building since it was closer. He said there were people in this neighborhood who recognized his car, and he didn't want anyone knowing which floor she lived on. He said it as casually as if he were talking about the weather, and then he didn't explain anything more. From then on, every time he drove her home, he stopped in that exact place, and every time he waited until the light came on in her apartment. One evening that month, when she got into the car after another late shift, she sat quietly for a long time, and then suddenly began talking about her mother. She told him Margaret had taught English at a high school for 22 years, that she had once been the woman with the best memory Bianca had ever known, able to recite entire poems she had taught before Bianca was even born, and that the first thing she lost hadn't been people's names, but the names of the streets around her own home. She told him that when Margaret was 56, the doctors had finally given the illness a name, and Bianca had gone online afterward to find out what early onset meant. She told him that now her mother lived somewhere in a year far away, and called Bianca by the name of an aunt who had been dead for a long time. Then she fell silent. She added that she didn't tell anyone these things, and she didn't know why she had told him tonight. Calvin offered no comfort. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't tell her she was strong. He didn't say any of the things people usually said. He simply remained quiet until she had finished, and then he said one sentence about his father, the only sentence he had ever said about him. He said his father died before he had the chance to do the right thing. Bianca waited for more. Nothing came. She turned toward him and asked what he did for a living. She said she had been working there for nearly a month, that she knew he owned the restaurant, but she also knew that a restaurant owner didn't need someone to scan the street before he stepped through a door. She said she wasn't asking because she wanted to pry. She was asking because she was taking his money, and she wanted to know where that money came from. Calvin didn't avoid the question. He didn't answer it either. He stared through the windshield for a while, then said that he would tell her, but not today. Bianca asked when. He said he didn't know, and that he wouldn't promise her a specific day, only to keep pushing it back. But he promised he wouldn't let her hear the truth from someone else. She sat with those words inside her for several seconds. Then she nodded. She said all right, and she said she would wait. But she also told him that when the time came, if she heard the truth and wanted to leave, then she would leave, and he wasn't allowed to stop her. Calvin said he wouldn't. He answered quickly, without hesitation, and she understood that he had already thought about that possibility before she ever spoke it aloud. She opened the car door, stepped out, and walked the half-block back to her building. When she reached her apartment and turned on the light, she looked down and saw that the car was still there, and it didn't pull away until after she closed the curtains. That night, Bianca lay awake thinking about what he had said about his father. She didn't know what right thing the man had meant to do, and she didn't know why he hadn't had time to do it. But she realized that the man who had been sitting beside her had spoken those words like someone who still carried them with him every single day, and she thought that perhaps that was the truest answer to the question she had just asked. Preston Whitaker couldn't find the man, but he found the waitress in a single afternoon, because she had a real name, tax records, an address, all the things the other man didn't have. And once he found her, he realized he didn't need to touch anyone at all. Bianca's vehicle was an old 2006 pickup truck that she kept parked along the street near her building, and only used when her shifts ended too late. That Wednesday morning, she came downstairs and it was gone. She was told it had been towed, because it was parked in a zone with restricted hours for street cleaning, and the sign had been put back up the week before. It cost her $280 to get the truck out, including the towing fee, 1 day of storage, and the ticket. 4 days later, it was towed a second time, on a different block, because it hadn't been parked far enough from a fire hydrant to meet the required distance. $340. The following week came the third time, this one because the inspection sticker on the windshield had expired 11 days earlier, a completely legal reason to tow a vehicle, and also something no one had bothered to notice during the 2.5 years she had lived there. $400. $1,020 in 14 days. Almost the same as 1 month's out-of-pocket difference at Ashwood. Bianca didn't retrieve the truck the third time. She left it in the impound lot and took the bus, and she sat calculating that every day it remained there. The storage fee climbed higher, and at some point the truck would be worth less than what it cost to get it back, and she would lose the truck altogether. She didn't know exactly which day that point would come. She only knew that 3 times in 2 weeks wasn't bad luck. She had also submitted 2 more applications for part-time morning work, because she needed another source of income to cover the gap. Both places called her back. Both scheduled interviews, then both canceled on the same day, 4 hours apart, and both used almost the exact same words, saying the position had already been filled and they were very sorry for the inconvenience. She called one of them back to ask about it. The person on the other end was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Miss Marsh, I can't tell you anything more," and hung up. Bianca stood in her kitchen holding the phone, and she remembered the landlord saying almost the same thing, and she began to understand the shape of what was happening to her. No one threatened her. No one followed her. No one called to curse at her. There were only pieces of paper, very polite phone calls, regulations that had always been sitting there in the law books, and that ordinarily no one bothered enforcing, except now they were being enforced against exactly one person, at exactly the right moments, often enough to matter. She couldn't sue anyone. She had nothing she could take to the police. Everything was legal. Then Friday morning came. Bianca went to Oak Park as usual, and as she passed the administrative desk, the coordinator called her over. The woman didn't say much. She simply handed Bianca an already opened envelope and said Ashwood had received it the day before and thought she ought to know. It was a letter from a law office downtown. It used the most polite language the legal profession possessed, and it didn't threaten anyone. The letter stated that the firm, acting on behalf of an unnamed interested party, respectfully requested that the facility reconsider the financial file of patient Margaret Marsh, specifically the long-term sustainability of paying the portion not covered by insurance, in light of the history of late payments during the previous 2 months, and the unstable employment status of the responsible family member. The letter said this raised a matter of concern regarding continuity of care, and that if there was a risk of interrupted payment, transferring the patient to a facility more appropriate to the family's financial means should be considered early, in the patient's own best interest. At the end was a sentence expressing respect for Ashwood's professional work. Bianca read the entire letter once. Then she read it a second time, more slowly, and halfway through that second reading, The paper in her hand began to shake, only slightly, the kind of trembling you don't feel in your fingers so much as hear in the faint sound of the paper. She laid it flat on the counter so it would stop making noise. She asked the coordinator what Ashwood was going to do. The woman said that for now, nothing. That the letter carried no legally binding force. That it was only a letter. But she added something else, and she said it in the voice of someone who had been doing this work for a long time. That letters like this usually didn't arrive alone, and that if payments continued to be late month after month, the facility would eventually be required to open a formal review under its procedures. And once that review was opened, the matter would no longer be in her hands. Bianca folded the letter into quarters and slipped it into the pocket of her coat. Then she continued down the hall to room number 7, as she did every day, sat on the edge of the bed, and took her mother's hand. Margaret was talking that day about some summer afternoon from long ago. Bianca nodded in the right places and smiled in the right places. And throughout the entire hour she sat there. She didn't mention the letter once, and she didn't allow her hand to tremble again, because the woman lying in that bed had already lost almost everything. And Bianca was determined not to let her lose the last thing she still had, which was the mercy of having no idea what was happening. The letter stayed in Bianca's coat pocket for 3 days. She didn't open it again, but she knew exactly where it was, and every time she put the coat on, she could feel the ridge of that paper folded into quarters through the fabric. On Monday morning, she went back to Oak Park, and she still left it in her pocket because she couldn't think of anywhere else to put it without having to look at it. Margaret didn't recognize her that day. She studied Bianca for a long moment, with the polite expression of someone receiving a kind but unfamiliar visitor, then asked whether she was from the church. Bianca said no. Then Margaret began telling her about some afternoon at the lake, and she told it in remarkable detail. Who had been sitting where, who had brought what, and she kept asking whether anyone had ever found the ring in the end, because the whole family had waded into the water, looking for it until dark. It had happened more than 40 years ago. Bianca hadn't been there. She had only heard the story a few times when she was little, and she couldn't remember how it ended either. So she said, "I think they did." And Margaret nodded and said, "Thank goodness," then seemed reassured and turned toward the window and went quiet for a very long time. Bianca sat holding her mother's hand without speaking. She thought about the letter in her pocket. She thought about the pickup truck sitting in the impound lot, while the storage fees climbed every day. She thought about the 21 days she had left before she had to leave her apartment, and then Margaret squeezed her hand. It wasn't the absent-minded grip she had held for the past hour. She squeezed hard, and Bianca looked up, and something in her mother's eyes had changed. The distant look was gone. Margaret looked directly into her daughter's face and called her by the right name. She said, "Bianca." Then she said, "You've gotten thin." Bianca didn't have time to answer. Margaret kept speaking, and she spoke with perfect clarity, one word at a time, in the voice of the woman who had stood in front of classrooms for 22 years. She said, "I don't know what's happening to you, but something is. I can see it." Bianca started to say, "Nothing's wrong, Mom." Margaret didn't let her. She tightened her grip and said, "Listen to me. Don't ever let anyone make you think you're cheap." Then she said one more thing. She said, "Your father died because he refused to think that way." Bianca sat completely still. She opened her mouth to ask what she meant. She wanted to ask what her mother had just said, what she meant by it, whether she was remembering something wrong. But by the time Bianca managed to make a sound, Margaret had turned her head toward the window, and the hand inside Bianca's had gone loose, and when she looked back, that distant expression had returned. She asked whether Bianca was from the church. The whole thing had lasted less than 40 seconds. Bianca stayed another 2 hours. She didn't ask another question because she knew it was useless, and because she had learned a long time ago that asking again only frightened her mother. She simply sat there, holding Margaret's hand, listening as she told the story about the afternoon at the lake 2 more times with slightly different details. And every time she asked about the ring, Bianca answered, "I think they found it." During those 2 hours, Bianca didn't cry. At one point her eyes began to burn, and she had to look down at the edge of the bed for a little while, but she didn't let it go any further because if she started, her mother would see, and her mother wouldn't understand why, and she would become afraid. Bianca's father had died in 2014, when Bianca was 16. She had been told that he was shot during a robbery, that the person responsible was never found, that things like that happened to police officers in this city. She had lived with that story for 11 years, and had never once thought to question it. But throughout the 2 hours she sat beside her mother's bed that afternoon, the sentence Margaret had spoken kept repeating in her mind. and Bianca couldn't make it fit inside the story she had always known. That evening she worked the late shift. She finished the entire shift without making a single mistake. By the time the last customer had gone, and she was wiping down a table, Calvin Ferrante rose from the corner table and asked whether she needed a ride home. She said yes. Halfway there, Bianca took the letter out of her coat pocket. She didn't say anything. She simply unfolded it and placed it on the dashboard in front of him, while the car was stopped at a red light. Calvin picked it up and read it. He read very slowly, all the way through the final sentence, the one expressing respect for the facility's professional work. Then he folded it again along the original creases and held it in his hand. The light turned green. He didn't move right away. A car behind them honked, and he remained still for another 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, Bianca looked over and saw that his face hadn't changed at all. He didn't frown. His jaw didn't tighten. Nothing. Only the hand holding the letter was strangely still, the kind of stillness a person uses when holding something very thin because he doesn't want to tear it. Then he drove on. He asked her exactly one question, whether the facility had opened a review file yet. She said no. He nodded and didn't ask anything else for the rest of the drive. When the car pulled over at the familiar spot half a block from her building, Bianca started to reach for the letter, but Calvin handed it back before she could. He said, "You keep it. This letter was sent to the facility, not to you, so you should know where it is." Bianca took it. She got out of the car, walked the half block to her building, went upstairs, and turned on the light. The car below pulled away after she closed the curtains, just as it always did. But that night, after it disappeared from view, Calvin didn't turn in the direction he usually took. Vincent Cardoza came to the restaurant close to midnight that night, not on Tuesday morning as he usually did. He brought the hardbound ledger with him and sat down at the corner table, and Calvin placed a copy of the letter on the table in front of him. Vincent finished reading it, rested one hand on the page, and said he could have someone go talk to the kid tonight. He added that Preston wasn't the kind of person who needed to be told twice. Calvin said no. Vincent asked once more to make certain, because that was his job. And Calvin answered a second time, more clearly, that no one was to touch Preston Whitaker. Not a finger, not a phone call. No one was to stand near his house, no one was to follow his car, and no one was to let him see the face of anyone connected to them. Vincent closed the ledger and asked what Calvin wanted to do instead. Calvin said the boy had nothing of his own. He didn't have his own money, didn't have his own company, didn't even have his own name. Everything he was using to do these things belonged to someone else. Then Calvin said that if you wanted to stop a man who didn't own anything, you had to speak to the person who did. He made a phone call at 12:20 in the morning. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. He didn't mention Bianca Marsh's name, didn't mention Ashwood, didn't mention the letter, didn't make a single threat, and didn't ask anyone to do anything specific. He only asked about a project, then said he had heard there were a few irregularities in the file, thanked the person on the other end, and hung up. On Tuesday morning, the city's Department of Water Management announced the temporary suspension of the drainage system permit for a $400 million high-rise project Whitaker Holdings was building in the West Loop, citing discrepancies in the flow calculations contained in technical documents submitted the previous year and requiring the plans to be resubmitted for review. It was an ordinary administrative decision, complete with a case number, a signature, and a deadline for correction. But the construction site stopped that same day, and every day it remained idle, cost more than $100,000 in labor and equipment sitting unused. On Wednesday morning, 2 banks sent letters. Both cited the material adverse change clause in their credit agreements. Both demanded additional collateral within 10 business days, or the loans would be called early. The 2 letters came from institutions with no connection to one another, arrived 40 minutes apart, and invoked the same clause that no bank had ever used against Whitaker Holdings in 14 years. Thursday afternoon, the first investor withdrew. Thursday night, the second investor withdrew. Friday morning, the third investor withdrew, and this one included a short note saying he was very sorry, but he had other commitments he needed to protect. 4 days. Not a single threat had been spoken. No one had been touched. There was nothing to report to the police, nothing to take to court, not one name appearing anywhere. There was only paperwork, and every piece of it was legitimate. Preston received a message from his father's assistant at noon on Friday, telling him to come home immediately. He went, and he walked into the study wearing the irritated expression of a man who had been called away in the middle of his day. And before he could even sit down, Roland Whitaker was already on his feet. He threw a stack of papers onto the desk. He asked, "Who did you touch?" Preston said he didn't know what his father was talking about. Roland asked again, louder this time, What have you done over the past 3 weeks? And to whom? Preston started talking about some waitress in the Gold Coast. Said she had spilled wine. Said some man had stepped in. Some man nobody knew. A man with no records, no history, nothing at all. He stopped there because he saw his father's face. Roland Whitaker had been a United States Senator from Illinois for 12 years. Preston had watched his father sit in rooms where the entire country waited for the outcome. Had watched him argue with governors. Had watched him stand in front of 30 microphones and smile. Preston had never seen his father look like that. Roland didn't ask anything more about the girl. He didn't shout anymore either. Very quietly, he asked what the man had said to him. Preston repeated those 11 words. Roland listened, then lowered himself into his chair slowly, as though his legs had suddenly stopped being able to hold him. He said nothing for about 10 seconds. Then he asked another question. Which table was he sitting at? Preston didn't understand what the question meant. He said the corner table. Roland gave the smallest nod, and it was the nod of a man who had just received confirmation of something he had already suspected and desperately hoped he was wrong about. Preston asked what was wrong. Roland didn't answer. Preston asked again, and this time he could hear his own voice rising higher than usual as he asked, "You know him?" Roland Whitaker looked up at his son, and there was no anger in his eyes, no disappointment, nothing from the familiar catalog of things Preston had spent 29 years receiving from his father. There was only one thing there. Something Preston had never seen in this man before, and it took him several seconds to find the word for it in his own mind. It was fear. Roland Whitaker told his son nothing. He simply ordered Preston to stay put, do nothing else, go nowhere, and wait for him to handle it. Preston listened, then walked straight toward the door. In all his life, he had never seen his father afraid of anyone, and now that he had, it didn't make him retreat a single step. It only made him need to know. He needed to know what that man with no records was. What kind of thing could make a United States Senator sink into a chair? And the only way Preston could think of finding out was to ask the man himself, somewhere without 43 dining tables, and without anyone holding up a phone. It took him and Julian 4 days to learn the routine. The River North restaurant, 3 evenings a week, usually sometime in the late afternoon or early evening, and the car was always parked in the underground garage of the building next door. At 11 o'clock Thursday night, Bianca Marsh wasn't there. She had traded shifts earlier that week because Ashwood had called to say her mother had had a restless night, and Bianca was sitting in room number 7 in Oak Park, nearly 14 miles away, completely unaware of what was happening. On the other side of it, Vincent Cardoza already knew. He had known since the second day, because one of his men had seen Julian Pike's car circle the building for the 3rd time. Vincent laid out his plan in very few words. It required only 4 men, and it would be over before the kid even had time to get out of the car. Calvin said no. Vincent asked again. Calvin said that if one of their people laid a hand on the son of a United States Senator in a parking garage in Chicago, then within 2 weeks a federal agency would open a file, and that file wouldn't stop with the kid. He said it would move backward through everything, and sooner or later it would touch things his family had kept hidden for 3 generations. Vincent said that in that case, Calvin shouldn't go down into the garage alone either. Calvin said that was exactly what he was going to do, and he ordered everyone to remain outside the building. No one was to go downstairs, no matter what they heard. Vincent Cardoza had worked for this family for 31 years, and he didn't argue with an order, but when he stood, he did say one thing. He said your father would have never gone alone. Calvin didn't answer. At 11 that night, the underground garage was almost empty. Calvin stepped out of the elevator and started toward his car, and the other 3 men emerged from behind a concrete pillar about 33 feet away. Julian was holding an iron bar. Blake had the other one, but the way he held it looked more like a man carrying something for someone else than a man preparing to use it. Preston walked between them. He spoke loudly, and his voice echoed off the low concrete ceiling. He said this time nobody was watching. He said there wasn't any waitress here for you to play hero for. Calvin stopped about 5 steps away. He didn't ask what they wanted. He didn't tell them to go home. He didn't repeat the 11 words from that night. He only removed the watch from his left wrist, set it on the hood of the car beside him, lowered both hands to his sides, and stood there. Not one word. Over the past 3 weeks, Preston had imagined countless versions of this moment, and in every one of them, the other man said something. Julian rushed forward first. He rushed because Preston was standing there watching, because he had spent 4 days saying this would be easy, and because he needed to prove it before anyone had time to doubt him. 3 seconds later, Julian was lying on the concrete. The iron bar had slipped from his hand and rolled somewhere beneath a car. He wasn't injured anywhere. Not a scratch, no blood, Nothing broken. He lay on his side and didn't get up, and the reason he didn't get up was something it would take him months to put into words. He would eventually say that while he was lying there, he understood with absolute clarity that the man standing above him had just had at least 3 choices and had deliberately chosen the least severe of the 3, and that if Julian moved, that choice might be reconsidered. Blake Turner remained exactly where he was. He looked at Julian on the ground, then at the man still standing upright and breathing evenly, as though he had merely walked through a doorway, and then Blake bent down and placed his iron bar carefully on the concrete. He didn't throw it. He said, "I'm done." He said, "I'm not signing up for this." Preston spun toward him and shouted his name. Blake didn't look at him. He walked toward the exit, didn't run, and went straight out of the garage without looking back once. Preston was alone. He charged. What happened next was very fast and involved very little movement. His body was turned, his right arm was brought behind his back, and then everything stopped. Calvin held it precisely at the point where both the shoulder joint and the wrist had reached the limits of their range, holding it there without adding even the slightest pressure. It was a position from which several different things could happen next, and Calvin chose none of them. He simply held. Preston didn't understand that. In 29 years, no one had ever taken him all the way to a threshold and then stopped there, so he had no way to read the position he was in, and the only thing inside him at that moment was unbearable rage at realizing he couldn't move. He fought against the hold. He wrenched with all of his own strength, with everything 29 years of never being stopped had taught him to use, and his right wrist broke in the force of his own struggle. Calvin released him immediately. He let go the instant he felt it happen, faster than thought, but it had already happened, and there was no movement in the world that could undo what had already been done. Preston dropped onto one knee, clutching his right hand with his left, his face drained white. Calvin stepped back once and stood still. He said nothing. He looked at the young man kneeling on the ground for several seconds, then took out his phone and called a number. And the first thing he said was the address of the parking garage, and the second was to send an ambulance. The ambulance arrived first. The police came 4 minutes later. 2 patrol cars, their lights sweeping in circles across the low concrete pillars. Julian Pike had managed to sit up and was now standing against a parked car, both hands resting loosely in front of his stomach, and he wasn't saying anything. Preston Whitaker started talking the moment the first officer approached. He said the other man had attacked him. He said he and his friends had come down to the garage to get their car and had been stopped. He raised his right arm as evidence, and it was very good evidence, because the injury was real. He claimed the man had intentionally twisted and snapped his wrist without provocation. He said his father was Senator Roland Whitaker, and demanded that the man be put in handcuffs immediately. Calvin Ferrante stood a few steps away with both hands outside his pockets, and he didn't argue a single word. He did exactly what he was told, stood where they directed him to stand, handed over his identification when they asked, and remained silent. One officer held Calvin's driver's license beneath the beam of a flashlight and read the name printed on it, and Bianca would never know that in that exact second, something very small changed in the officer's face. He didn't say anything. He simply handed the license back and took half a step away. Roland Whitaker arrived 15 minutes later. He was in Illinois for the weekend, and Preston had called him from inside the ambulance. He walked quickly down the garage ramp, still wearing his coat, and he began speaking while he was still about 33 feet away, asking who was in charge, demanding to know why his son was sitting inside an ambulance. Then he stepped through the beam of a headlight and saw the man standing motionless beside a concrete pillar. He stopped. Not the way someone stops when he is angry. He stopped completely, straightened his body, and let both hands fall to his sides. Then he spoke. "Mr. Ferrante." The entire garage fell silent. Preston, sitting on the rear step of the ambulance with his right arm already secured in a temporary splint, turned his head toward his father. Roland didn't look at his son. He took 2 more steps toward Calvin and said, "I am deeply sorry." He said, "I didn't know about this. I wasn't informed, and if I had known, it would have never happened." He said it in a voice Preston had never heard his father use with anyone, not even a governor, not even the people whose support he needed. It was the voice of a man asking for mercy. Calvin didn't answer. He looked at Roland for a moment, then turned his face away, and that simple act of looking away drained more color from Roland's face than if Calvin had shouted at him. Vincent Cardoza appeared at the entrance to the garage at that same moment, walking alone, carrying the hardbound ledger in one hand as he always did. He didn't go to Calvin. He walked directly to the ambulance and stopped in front of Preston, and he spoke in the voice of a man reading a report at a morning meeting. He said the Ferrante family had controlled the freight routes bringing goods into this city since 1968. He said 3 generations of that family had held influence over most of the loading unions, and that a significant number of the names appearing on ballots in Cook County over the past 4 decades had passed across their table before ever reaching the voters. Then he paused for one beat and gave the final sentence. He said your father began taking their money in 2006, when you were 10 years old. Preston looked toward his father. Roland Whitaker didn't say that wasn't true. He didn't say anything at all. He stood there beneath the revolving lights of the police cars and looked down at the concrete floor. And Preston, 29 years old, the son of a United States senator, understood in one single second that everything he had, every door that had already been opened for him, every lawyer who had arrived to clean things up before sunrise, all of it had been paid for by the man in front of whom Preston had torn a waitress's clothes. He let out a laugh, but the sound broke halfway through, and then he shouted. He shouted that he didn't care who the man was. He shouted it twice. No one answered him. Calvin Ferrante didn't say a word. He didn't even look toward the ambulance. He simply turned toward the nearest police officer, raised one hand, and pointed to a spot on the concrete ceiling above the garage entrance. There was a camera. The officer looked up in the direction Calvin was pointing. Then he lowered his eyes and looked at Preston, and the expression on his face changed before he had time to say anything. Preston looked up too. He stared at that camera and calculated very quickly in his head where it was positioned, what angle it covered, what it would have seen, and every calculation led to the same answer. It was aimed directly at the ramp. It had seen the 3 of them come down. It had seen the 2 iron bars. It had seen the other man step out of the elevator afterward, alone, carrying nothing, and it had been recording before any of them had ever set foot in the garage. Preston lowered his eyes. He didn't shout again. Behind him, Roland Whitaker finally spoke, but he wasn't talking to his son, and he wasn't talking to the police. He spoke to Calvin, and he asked only one question. What are you going to do now? Calvin Ferrante lowered his hand, walked over to the nearby car, picked up his watch from the hood, and fastened it around his wrist. Then he said, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to let them do it. On Monday morning, Calvin's attorney sat across from him and spoke for exactly 40 minutes. The parking garage camera footage was the kind of evidence prosecutors could only dream of having. Clean, continuous, time-stamped, clearly showing 3 men carrying 2 iron bars walking down into the garage first, and clearly showing the 4th man stepping out of the elevator afterward, alone, empty-handed. He said that with footage like that, they could push the case to the most serious level Illinois law allowed, could add a conspiracy charge, could seek actual prison time, and with the defendant being the son of a sitting United States senator, the press would feast on it for 6 months. He said that if Calvin wanted the boy erased from public life forever, this was the moment, and all he had to do was nod. Calvin listened to everything. Then he said no. The attorney asked if he was certain, because an opportunity like this wouldn't come again. Calvin said that if I crush that boy, all I prove is that he was right, that whoever is stronger gets to do whatever he wants. He added that justice and punishment aren't the same thing, and people confuse the two because both can make you feel good. He gave only one instruction, that the original footage be submitted to the prosecutors in full, unedited, with no recommendation of any kind attached to it. And after that, it was up to them. The attorney wrote it down and didn't ask another question. 3 days later, Blake Turner walked into the Cook County State's Attorney's office alone, without a lawyer, and turned over the complete original video he had recorded that Saturday night at the Gold Coast restaurant. 4 minutes and 11 seconds, with audio, not a single frame cut. That same day, he sent one copy to a newspaper and another to the attorney Bianca Marsh had hired 2 weeks earlier, the one she had thought she would never be able to afford. Those 4 minutes and 11 seconds contained everything the 19-second clip had left out. They showed Preston Whitaker touching her waist the first time, and her stepping back and apologizing. They showed him grabbing her wrist and pulling her toward him. The audio was all there, clear down to every word, including the sentence he had said loudly enough for the entire room to hear about how much 1 month of her wages was worth. And there were all 43 people sitting at dinner, seeing everything, hearing everything, and not one of them standing up. The full video circulated for 2 days and did exactly what the 19-second clip had done, only in the opposite direction. The newspaper published a correction and an apology. The restaurant chain issued a statement saying that the termination of Miss Marsh's employment had resulted from incomplete information and offered to reinstate her. Bianca didn't respond to the statement. She only asked them to correct the reason listed in her termination record, and they did. Preston Whitaker pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and violent disorderly conduct. His right wrist required 2 surgeries in 3 weeks. His attorney negotiated supervised probation, community service, and a civil settlement, and no one in the courtroom that day mentioned why the injured party hadn't asked for something harsher. But everything had a price. Beginning on the second day after the night in the garage, reporters started asking who the man in the footage was, and it took them less than a week to find the name that paid investigators had failed to uncover. The first article contained only one line, saying that the victim in the West Loop parking garage assault had been identified as Mr. Calvin Ferrante, and that the Ferrante name had long been associated with certain transportation businesses and labor unions in Chicago. The second article was longer. It mentioned 3 generations. It mentioned federal investigations in the 1990s that had closed without anyone being charged. It mentioned that name appearing beside other names every Chicagoan knew how to pronounce. Bianca read the second article on Friday afternoon in the employee break room, on her phone, 15 minutes before her shift began. She read it very slowly, all the way to the end, then scrolled back up and read it again from the beginning. She thought about the man who had spent 4 seconds reading the street. She thought about the tiny pause before the word boss. She thought about the paper ledger that never left a single page behind. About the chair that was never turned away from the door. About the half block where he always stopped before her building. And about the sentence he had spoken when he said there were people in this neighborhood who recognized his car. For nearly 2 months, all those pieces had been scattered through her mind like details that belonged to different stories. Now they came together, and they fit perfectly. So perfectly that she felt sick. She turned off the screen. She stood up, retied her apron, and walked out onto the floor exactly on time. Because she needed this shift. Because Ashwood's payment was due again the following Friday. And because she had survived 27 years by finishing the work in front of her before allowing herself to think. Around 9 that evening, she passed the kitchen door and looked through the round glass window. Calvin Ferrante was sitting at the corner table, facing the entrance as always. He looked up and caught her eyes through the glass. He didn't nod. She didn't nod. They looked at each other for about 3 seconds through that round pane of glass, and neither of them said a word. And then she pushed the door and went back into the kitchen. The woman was waiting for Bianca at the bus stop outside Ashwood on Tuesday afternoon the following week. She showed her identification before saying anything else, and the card read Claire Bishop, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Chicago Field Office. She said she needed about 40 minutes, that the conversation was voluntary, that Bianca had the right to stand up and leave at any time, and that she wasn't going to ask her a single question. She said she had come to give her something. The 2 women sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks away. Claire Bishop placed a thick gray file folder on the table, with a label fixed to the cover. She opened it to the first page and turned it toward Bianca. She said that in 2014, Bianca's father, police officer Daniel Marsh, had officially been recorded as having died from a gunshot wound during an armed robbery in the area near an overpass, that the case had never been solved, and that the file had eventually been closed with the perpetrator unidentified. She said that was what the Chicago Police Department had told Bianca's family. Then she turned to the next page. She said that during the 18 months before his death, Daniel Marsh had been working with a financial crimes task force, and he had been tracing money moving through 4 shell companies involved in commercial real estate. She said he had assembled bank statements, transfer agreements, and recordings of 3 meetings. She turned another page and said that the money trail led to Roland Whitaker, who at the time was a state representative preparing to run for federal office. Bianca said nothing. Claire continued. She said that on April 19th of that year, someone approached Daniel Marsh and offered him $200,000 to turn over the documents and close that line of investigation. She said he refused. She said he was dead 4 days later. She said the men who carried it out worked for Roland Whitaker, that the Bureau had identified 2 of the 3 names, and that one of those 2 men had died in 2020. Claire Bishop delivered all of this in the same voice, steady, never faster, never slower, never lowering it at any particular point, exactly like someone reading through an evidence inventory. That was why Bianca couldn't interrupt her. She sat perfectly still with both hands in her lap, and she could hear the coffee machine behind the counter with astonishing clarity. Then Claire Bishop came to the final part, and she spoke even more clearly than she had before. She said her father's documents had not been destroyed. She said that about 7 months after his death, the entire collection had been purchased from an intermediary, and it had remained in a Ferrante family safe ever since, for 11 years. She spoke the next sentence before Bianca could ask, because she had sat across from enough people to know what question was coming. She said the Ferrante family had nothing to do with her father's death. She repeated it once more slowly, saying that they hadn't killed him, hadn't ordered it, and hadn't known about it beforehand. They had bought what the men who killed him hadn't been smart enough to destroy. Bianca asked her first question of the entire conversation. She asked what they had bought it for. Claire Bishop looked at her for a moment, then said, "Miss Marsh, they didn't buy it to bring the truth into the light." She said that a file like that, in the right hands, was worth far more than a conviction. She said that if a United States senator knew someone possessed material like that, he would sign what needed to be signed, make the calls that needed to be made, and never ask why. She said that over the past 11 years, Roland Whittaker had cast votes, made appointments, and intervened in matters he ordinarily would have stayed away from. She said the evidence surrounding her father's death had been used as leverage. Bianca sat there for a very long time without speaking. Then she heard her own voice ask why she was telling her now. Claire Bishop said the Bureau was reopening her father's case, and as his next of kin, Bianca had the right to know before it appeared in the newspapers. She said she hadn't come to ask Bianca to testify about anything, and she wasn't asking who Bianca worked for, although both women sitting at that table knew that Claire already knew. Before standing, she placed a business card on top of the file and said that if Bianca wanted to see the complete copy, she had the right to request it. Then she left. Bianca remained in that coffee shop until the drink in front of her had gone completely cold. She didn't cry. She only sat there while one sentence repeated over and over in her mind, the sentence her mother had spoken during those 40 seconds of clarity less than 3 weeks earlier, the sentence Bianca hadn't understood then and hadn't had time to ask about. Your father died because he refused to think that way. For 11 years, she had lived with the words armed robbery. For 11 years, she had believed her father had died because of bad luck, because he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now she knew that he had died because he had said no to $200,000, and she knew that the only woman in the world who still remembered what had happened could now return to herself for only a few dozen seconds at a time, and wouldn't even remember that she had spoken the truth aloud. And Bianca knew one more thing. She knew that for all of those 11 years, this truth had been sitting inside a safe, carefully preserved, protected like a valuable asset, by the same man who had taken off his own jacket to cover her in front of 43 people. Bianca didn't wait until her shift. She took the bus back to River North that same afternoon, walked straight across the restaurant floor, and when the manager called her name, she didn't stop. Calvin Ferrante was sitting at the corner table with Vincent Cardoza. He saw her when she was still 10 steps away, looked at her face, and said one word to Vincent. The old man closed the ledger, stood up, and walked away without looking at her even once. Bianca pulled out the chair and sat across from Calvin. She placed Claire Bishop's business card on the table between them. She didn't need to say anything more. Calvin looked at the card for about 2 seconds, then raised his eyes. And he didn't ask what she told you. Didn't ask whether you believe her. Didn't ask how much you heard. Bianca looked straight into his face and asked whether her father's file was in his family's safe. He said yes. He said the word immediately, without a pause before it, without looking away. Bianca had spent the entire ride from Oak Park running through every possible version of his answer in her mind, and this wasn't one of them, because she had prepared herself for a denial, an explanation, a question thrown back at her, anything that carried the shape of self-defense. She sat still for one beat, then asked how long he had known. Calvin said the file had existed for 11 years. He said he had known about it for 6, from the day his father died, and Calvin opened the safe. Bianca asked what he had done with it during those 6 years. He said he kept it. He said he hadn't added anything, hadn't removed anything, and hadn't given it to anyone. She asked whether he had used it. Calvin was silent for about 2 seconds, then said yes. He said that over the past 6 years, 3 times he had someone remind Roland Whittaker's office that the file was still there. He said he hadn't needed to say anything more than those 3 times. Bianca felt something inside her chest drop 1 level lower. She asked the next question very slowly, because she wanted to hear every word clearly as she said it. She asked whether her father's death was an asset to him. She used that word and left it lying there between them. Calvin Ferrante didn't avoid it. He said yes. He didn't say another word after that. He didn't say that at the time he hadn't known who she was. He didn't say that he hadn't killed her father, even though that was true and he had every right to say it. He didn't say that if he hadn't bought the file, the others would have destroyed it, and nothing would have remained, even though that was true too. He didn't say that he had changed over the past 2 months. Didn't say he regretted it. didn't offer a single sentence shaped like a request to be seen differently. He simply sat there and accepted it. And that was what Bianca couldn't bear. Because if he had lied, she would have had somewhere to put her anger. But like this, there was nothing left for her to do, except sit there and look at the truth, lying whole and untouched on the table between them. She asked whether, that night in the restaurant when he stood up, he had known whose daughter she was. Calvin said no. He said he found out 3 days later. She asked what he had done 3 days later. He said he found you a job. Bianca asked why he hadn't told her. Calvin said that he had told her he would tell her, but not that day. He said he had intended to tell her, and he hadn't said when, and he knew that now none of that meant anything anymore. She sat in silence for a long time. Then she asked the last question. She asked whether he intended to give the file to the bureau. Calvin didn't answer. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no either. He didn't say, let me think about it. Didn't say it was complicated. Didn't say it involved many other people besides himself. He simply sat there looking at her, and he stayed silent. And the silence lasted long enough to become an answer. Bianca understood that he wasn't saying no because he didn't want to lie to her, and he wasn't saying yes because he wasn't ready to do it. And she understood that if he had been able to say yes in that moment, he would have already said it. She gave one very small nod, not to him, but to herself. Then she opened her bag, took out the restaurant keys, removed the back door key and the employee locker key from the ring, and placed both of them on the table beside the business card. She said, I asked you what you did for a living, and you told me to wait. She said, I told you that when the time came, if I heard the truth and wanted to leave, then I would leave. She said, you promised you wouldn't stop me. Calvin Ferrante looked at the 2 keys lying on the table. Then he said, all right, just those 2 words. He didn't stand up. He didn't call her name. He didn't reach out. Didn't say listen to me first. Didn't say anything that might keep her there for another 3 seconds, because he had promised, and because the only thing he had left to give her in that moment was keeping that promise. Bianca stood up. She walked across the restaurant floor, went out through the front door, and didn't look back. Behind her, the man at the corner table remained exactly where he was, facing the entrance as always, and he sat there for a very long time after the door had closed. Bianca found another job within 4 days. It was at a diner on Halsted Street in Bridgeport that stayed open until 2 in the morning, owned by a Polish woman who had been working the kitchen there for 20 years, and asked Bianca only 2 questions: whether she could work nights and whether she could carry a tray with 4 plates on it. The pay was much lower than it had been in River North. The tips here were $1 bills left beneath plates. She worked 6 nights a week, slept in the mornings, went to Oak Park in the early afternoon before heading to work, and arranged every part of her life so tightly that there was no empty space left for her mind to wander. That month's Ashwood payment was 4 days late, but she paid it in full. During the first week, she brought the suit jacket back to the River North restaurant before opening time, folded neatly inside a paper bag, and handed it to the manager. She asked him to return it to Calvin. The manager took the bag and said the boss had left word that if she needed anything, she could tell him. Bianca said thank you and walked out. 3 days later, the attorney she had hired called to tell her that a civil settlement from the other side had been transferred into the trust account, and at the same time another payment, anonymous, had been offered directly to the Oak Park facility to cover 12 months in advance. Bianca asked where the second payment had come from. The attorney said he wasn't permitted to say. She told him to refuse it. He asked once more to make certain, and she said refuse it, and added that if they tried to send it again, he was to refuse it again. Meanwhile, in River North, Vincent Cardoza placed the hardbound ledger on the table and didn't open it. He said he had heard, and he wanted to say this once, only once, and after that he would do whatever he was told. He said the Whitaker file wasn't sitting alone in that safe. He said it was beside other things, and connected to other things, because the way they had acquired it in 2014 involved 3 layers of intermediaries, and every one of those layers belonged to this family. He said that simply explaining why those documents were in Calvin's possession would be enough for them to open a file on him. Then he came to the most important part, and he spoke very slowly. He said that once the Bureau got inside one place, they wouldn't stop there. He said they would work backward, and they would go farther back than Calvin imagined. And what sat at the other end wasn't Calvin, but his father and his grandfather and 30 years of records that no living person remained to explain. He said Calvin's father and grandfather would have never done this. Calvin Ferrante sat quietly and listened to all of it. Then he said, that's exactly why. Vincent waited for him to say more. Calvin didn't. The old man sat there for a while, and he was the only person in the city who knew that the father of the man sitting across from him had died on a March morning in 2019, with a file locked in a safe and an intention he had never lived long enough to carry out. And Vincent understood what the son had just decided. He didn't argue anymore. He only asked when. Calvin said this week. The attorney objected in writing, and then he objected for 40 straight minutes, using the words a good lawyer was supposed to use when his client was preparing to do something that couldn't be undone. He said at the very least, negotiate. He said there were tools for exchanging something like this for an agreement, that people did it all the time, that this was how things worked, and that if Calvin would only agree to sit down, they could secure a promise not to prosecute before handing over anything. Calvin said no. The attorney asked what the conditions were then. Calvin said there were none. The attorney asked again. No immunity. No plea agreement. Nothing in exchange for any of it. Calvin said that's right. The attorney set down his pen and said he couldn't advise his client to do this. Calvin said, I'm not asking for advice. I'm telling you. The handover took place Thursday morning at the Bureau's office on South Dearborn Street. The entire contents of the file were surrendered exactly as they were, including bank statements, transfer agreements, 3 audio recordings, and the records from the intermediary layer that had sold the material again in 2014, which meant the very portion proving that it had passed through Ferrante hands. There was no negotiating attorney sitting at the table. No document was signed promising anything in return. Claire Bishop asked whether he wanted to make a statement for the recording, and Calvin said the documents spoke for themselves. He walked out of that building at 10:40 in the morning, and before that day was over, 2 things had begun moving forward in parallel. One was the investigation into Senator Roland Whitaker, and the other was a separate file bearing Calvin Ferrante's own name. He didn't call Bianca Marsh. He didn't send a message. Didn't ask anyone to pass word to her. Didn't let anyone in River North know what had happened, so that the news might eventually reach her. Her name didn't appear anywhere in the paperwork from that morning. That night she was still carrying trays at the diner on Halsted Street, just as she had for the previous 5 nights, and would for the next 10. And she knew nothing at all. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Ashwood called Bianca at 4:20 on Tuesday morning. She was on her way home after the night shift, and instead of going back to her apartment, she took a taxi straight to Oak Park. But by the time she arrived, it was already over. Margaret Marsh had died in her sleep. Nothing sudden, nothing that required an emergency response. They told Bianca that she had gone very peacefully. Bianca sat beside her mother's bed for about 40 minutes, still holding her hand the way she had every afternoon for the past 3 years. And she didn't say anything at all. The funeral was held Friday morning at a small funeral home in Bridgeport, because Bianca had chosen the least expensive place that still felt decent. She arranged for 40 chairs because that was all the funeral home had, and she already knew most of them would be empty. Margaret had disappeared from other people's lives 6 years earlier. Her old colleagues from the high school had either moved away or lost touch, and those who still remembered her remembered a different woman from the one lying in the casket now. The 2 people who came with Bianca that morning were old friends from high school, the only 2 whose phone numbers she had managed to keep. She sat in the front row between them. The pastor began exactly on time. Bianca kept her head bowed through the first part of the service, her eyes lowered toward the 2 hands resting in her lap, and she heard the door behind her open and close again, and she thought someone had wandered into the wrong room. When the pastor reached the final part and asked everyone to stand, Bianca rose and turned around. Every chair behind her was occupied, and behind those rows of chairs, along the back wall of the room, men in dark coats stood in 2 lines, none of them sitting, none of them speaking, their hands held in front of them. She couldn't count them. Maybe 40, maybe more. Not one of them stepped forward. Not one came to shake her hand. No one offered an envelope. No one spoke words of condolence. No one did anything that required her to answer. They were simply there. Bianca looked along the last row, and nearest the door, standing slightly inside the shadow of the wall, was Calvin Ferrante. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking straight ahead, toward the casket. Bianca turned back around. She listened to the rest of the service without looking behind her again. And when the pastor spoke the final words, when the sound of chairs began scraping across the floor, she heard the door behind her open and close one more time, and by the time she turned around, the place where Calvin had been standing was empty. The cemetery was 20 minutes away, in the parish burial grounds where Bianca and her mother had buried her father 11 years earlier. Bianca had chosen the grave beside his for Margaret because the plot had been purchased back then, and because her mother had given exactly one instruction about it before she began forgetting everything. The car brought Bianca there close to noon. She walked along the familiar gravel path, carrying a few flowers, following the same route she had taken twice a year for 11 years. And she knew exactly how many rows to count after the turn, exactly where to look down, because her father's grave had never been easy to find. For 11 years, there had been nothing there but an aluminum marker stamped with his name, the kind a funeral home places temporarily in the ground, while the family waits to purchase a headstone. Bianca had asked about the price the first year, then again the third year, and after that she stopped asking because every time she did, the number ended up beside another number in her graph paper notebook, and it always lost. She had thought she would do it when her mother got better. Then her mother didn't get better. Bianca made the familiar turn, lifted her eyes, and stopped. Beside the freshly opened earth waiting for her mother, in the place where for 11 years there had been only a crooked aluminum marker in the grass, there was now a low gray granite headstone. No decoration, no cross, no scripture. His name was carved into it, along with the 2 numbers marking the year he was born and the year he died, and beneath them was a single line. Daniel Marsh? He said no. Bianca stood there for a very long time. Her 2 friends remained several steps behind her and didn't come closer. She didn't ask who had done this because there was no one there to ask. She didn't call anyone. She didn't speak a single word aloud. Not to her mother, not to her father, not even to herself. She simply knelt beside the headstone, placed the flowers down, reached out, and touched the cold stone where those words had been carved, and she left her hand there for a very long time. 3 weeks later, the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois announced a 14-count indictment against United States Senator Roland Whitaker, including money laundering, bribery while holding public office, federal wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. That same day, the case involving the death of Officer Daniel Marsh was reopened. The court ordered related assets frozen while the investigation proceeded, and the trust fund in Preston Whitaker's name, the fund that had paid every lawyer who had ever arrived to clean things up before sunrise throughout his 29 years, was frozen on a Wednesday afternoon without anyone calling him first. By November, Preston Whitaker was working the night shift, doing data entry at a warehouse outside Cicero, from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, typing shipment codes with his left hand. His right wrist had gone through 2 surgeries, and the doctor had told him its function would never return to what it had been, that he would still be able to hold light objects, but would never be able to grip anything tightly again. The trust fund had been frozen. Julian Pike had moved to Arizona and no longer answered his messages. His father was appearing in court every month. No one called Preston anymore, and no lawyers came to clean anything up before sunrise. One night in the middle of that month, he was eating at an all-night diner near the warehouse at around 2 in the morning, when a drunk man at the table in front of him ordered another drink and was refused, then started raising his voice, then yanked the tray out of the waitress's hands as she stood beside the table. The tray crashed to the floor. The young woman stood there with no idea what to do with her hands. Preston looked around the diner. 6 other people were eating. Every one of them lowered their eyes to their plates. One man turned his head toward the window. Preston recognized that silence immediately, because he had once stood on the other side of it, in the middle of a dining room, where 43 people had been just as silent as these people were now. Preston stood up. He walked over and placed himself between the 2 of them, and he said 2 words. "That's enough." The other man turned toward him, and for those 2 seconds Preston knew with perfect clarity that he didn't have the strength to do much of anything if the situation went further. His right hand couldn't even close around a glass, but the man only cursed at him once and walked out. Preston bent down and picked up the broken plates with his left hand. The waitress said thank you. He couldn't bring himself to answer, and he left the diner before she had time to ask his name. 2 weeks later, he went to the diner on Halsted Street, near the end of Bianca's night shift. He didn't bring a lawyer. He didn't bring money. He didn't apologize with a typed letter. He sat at the last table and placed his right hand on the tabletop, the hand that could no longer close tightly, and left it there where she could see it. He said that all his life he had believed that if people were afraid of him, then he had value. And he had believed that for 29 years, and he had only understood that he was wrong when there was nothing left about him for anyone to fear. Bianca listened to everything. She didn't forgive him. She said, "You don't owe me because of the shirt." She said, "You owe me because for exactly 30 seconds, you made me believe that I really was cheap." She said, "If you want to repay that debt, then don't ever let anyone else believe that about themselves again." Preston nodded, stood up, and walked out, and he never returned to that diner. The following month, Bianca went looking for Calvin Ferrante. He was working out of an office much smaller than the old one, under investigation, having sold 2 of his 3 restaurants to pay legal fees, and having transferred most of what remained of his business interests to people with whom he no longer had any connection. She said, "You promised me something at that bus stop, and you broke that promise." Calvin looked at her and said, "I know." Then he added that he still did. He didn't explain. He didn't say that he couldn't bear thinking about that aluminum marker. He didn't ask her to understand. Bianca sat down across from him and asked the question she had carried inside herself for nearly a year. She asked whether, that night at the restaurant, he could have made Preston disappear before sunrise. He said he could have. She asked why he hadn't. Calvin was silent for a while, then said, "Because you were watching," he said. "I didn't want the first thing you saw in me to be the thing I'm best at." 18 months after the night in the Gold Coast, a small diner opened on Halsted Street. 11 tables, named Marsh. In the kitchen, a sheet of paper was taped to a cabinet door, with only one line written on it, saying that no employee here has to endure mistreatment from anyone. Not a customer, not even the owner. 3 nights a week, a man came in to wash dishes on the evening shift, working with his left hand, speaking very little, and no one in the kitchen asked what he used to do. He had asked Bianca for the job 3 months prior, offering to work without pay to earn his redemption, but she had insisted on paying him minimum wage, establishing that in her diner, everyone's labor had value. Late that weekend night, Bianca locked the diner at nearly 1 a.m, pulled down the metal shutter, and turned toward the sidewalk. Calvin was waiting there beneath a streetlight, carrying nothing in his hands. The two of them walked toward the end of the street. This story leaves us with a few things worth thinking about together. A person's value isn't found in the uniform they wear, the job they do, or the amount of money in their bank account. It is found in the way they treat others when no one is forcing them to be kind. The greatest evil in that restaurant that night wasn't one bully. It was 43 people who saw everything and chose silence. Because every act of cruelty in this world needs a crowd willing to look away before it can grow. True strength isn't the ability to destroy someone. It is having that ability completely within your grasp and choosing not to use it. And finally, justice and punishment aren't the same thing, because punishment only soothes our anger, while justice is what restores dignity to the person who had it taken away. If this story has left something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share it so that every day more meaningful stories can reach more people. How did this story make you feel? And have you ever witnessed a moment when someone should have stood up, but everyone remained silent? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear what you feel deep in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.